Hello, and welcome to this live broadcast with the Liverpool Echo. Hello to everyone who's joining us on the Echo's Facebook page. I'm Liam Thorpe. I'm the political editor here at the Liverpool Echo. And as you may know, we regularly do these kind of Q&A sessions with leading figures and experts from around our region to help us get to grips with some of the bigger stories taking place right now. And one of the biggest stories, perhaps the biggest story at the moment, is the ongoing and unfolding crisis in Ukraine and in Russia. And I'm delighted to say that Dr. Michael Hopkins, who is a reader in US foreign policy at the University of Liverpool, has made time in his busy schedule to speak to us. Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins, for coming on the show today.
Pleased to be with you.
So I guess we'll start with the simple and hopefully at the beginning of this, really, for people who don't know a lot about this ongoing situation. Could you just kind of take us through a brief summary of how we got here and where things currently stand regarding Russia and Ukraine?
Certainly. I think we need to go back to December 1991 when the Soviet Union existed and Ukraine was one of the republics in the Soviet Union. It voted to become independent. And as a result of that, the Soviet Union broke up and Ukraine was an independent country. Russia was an independent country. In the 1990s, Russia was in something of an economic and political mess, something that Putin, when he came to power in 1999, wanted to reverse. He wanted strong leadership in the country, and he wanted Russia once again to be a strong country. That meant dominating the countries that were former members of the Soviet Union, like the Ukraine, dominating what he called the near abroad. And probably since 2013, 2014, he's adopted a much tougher attitude to the Ukraine. So he annexed Crimea in 2014 and initiated lots of trouble in the eastern part of the Ukraine, the Donbass area. And that has been continuing ever since. About 15,000 people have died there. In the last year or so, he's intensified the pressure on the Ukraine, and he tends to intensify pressure when he thinks the Ukraine is looking westward, either to the EU or to become a member of NATO. So I think that's the essence of what's going on.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hopkins. And I think we've got obviously this, there is a strong involvement with the United Kingdom and the United States. As you mentioned, NATO is a key issue here. I think we've got a clip from Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking recently about the ongoing crisis and where he thinks it's up to now.
I wish I could give everybody better news about this, but I have to tell you that the picture is continuing to be very grim. And today, as I'm sure you've already picked up, a kindergarten was shelled in what we're taking to be what we know was a false flag operation designed to discredit the Ukrainians, designed to create a pretext, a spurious provocation for Russian action. We fear very much that is the kind of thing we'll see more of over the next few days. And what we're doing is making sure that we do everything to strengthen the package of sanctions that will follow immediately should there be a Russian invasion. We're strengthening the eastern frontier of NATO, and I'll be going to the European Security Conference in Munich a little bit later on over the weekend to talk about what we're going to do to unify the West.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson there speaking about the unfolding situation in Ukraine and Russia, and he's been quite forthright on this, hasn't he? The UK have been, I guess, quite aggressive in their comments from the start, really.
Well, I think one of the things that people need to realize is that when the Ukraine became an independent country, it had about 1/3 of the nuclear missiles of the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, the third largest nuclear power in the world after the Soviet Union and the United States. But it was persuaded in December 1994, to give up those weapons and to sign up to what was known as a Budapest Memorandum. And in that memorandum, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia promised security assurances that the Ukraine would be a safe country. So that is really why the UK is a fairly prominent actor in this, because it feels a certain sense of responsibility.
You've talked about NATO there. Is the crux of this that Putin is worried about the eastern expanse of NATO. He doesn't want NATO to be, I guess, flanking Russia and with it the might of the West.
That is certainly what he publicly emphasizes. But in fact, I think that even if NATO had not expanded eastwards, he would still be seeking to dominate these countries. And one of the reasons these countries wanted to join NATO was because they feared this kind of domination. So NATO adds to his problems, yes, but his problem would be there anyway, so long as these countries were not pliant countries.
And by problem, you mean his ambitions?
Well, what he wants to do is, he doesn't want a recreation of the Soviet Union. He wants to dominate the East European territories. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, many of these were parts of the Russian Empire. They're not going to return to the Russian Empire, and he realizes it's better to have a kind of dominant arrangement such as he has with Belarus, where the leader there depends on Russian assistance. It's much easier, and it's less economically costly if you're not having a responsibility for any of the problems. So I think that's what he really wants to achieve, and NATO membership or EU arrangements, either membership or better economic relations with the EU, undermines that prospect for him.
And of course, a major player we've not spoken about in all of this is the United States. And I think we've got some words now from President Joe Biden.
Mr. President, how high is the threat of a Russian invasion right now?
It's very high.
Why?
It's very high because they have not moved any of their troops out. They've moved more troops in. Number one. Number two, we have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in. Every indication we have is they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine. Number one. Number two, I've been waiting for a response from Putin for my letter, my response to him. It's come to that Moscow embassy. They're faxing it here. Not faxing it, they're sending it here. I have not read it yet. I cannot comment on it.
Have you been briefed on it in any way?
Oh,
yeah. Is your sense that this is going to happen now?
Yes. My sense this will happen in the next several days.
What does this mean? Is there any diplomatic path still available?
Yes, there is. There's a clear diplomatic path. That's why I asked Secretary Blinken to go to the United Nations and make his statement today. He'll lay out what that path is. I've laid out a path to Putin as well on, I think, Sunday. And so there is a path. There is a way through this.
Are you going to call Putin? Will you speak to Putin? Are you going to call Putin?
I'm not calling Putin. I have no plans to call Putin right now.
Do you think he's made a final decision first?
So that's President Joe Biden saying pretty unequivocally that the analysis and the evidence that the US have is that Russia could invade Ukraine any day now. What do you say to people who say that it's actually the US and the UK and the West who are actually the ones ramping up the rhetoric here?
Well, I think we need to separate out a number of elements. First of all, nobody really knows whether an invasion is going to take place. And the reason they say that is because everything is in position for an invasion. There are sufficient troops, there are all kinds of indications of moving closer to the border. They've got the kind of facilities such as field hospitals. In other words, the capability is there, and they don't want to be surprised by saying nothing's going to happen, then suddenly it does happen. So that's why they're saying that. When we come to the question about who is causing the problem, there's no question that quite tough rhetoric is being issued from across Europe. The United Kingdom and the US are particularly prominent, but NATO and the EU are all talking very tough. And the reason they're talking tough is, why are there 130,000 troops surrounding the borders of the Ukraine? Sending support, sending weapons, defensive weapons, and so on, might be termed adding to the problem, but to do otherwise would be to ignore the problem. And so I think that I'm unpersuaded by those who say that the situation is made worse by the tough talk of the West.
In terms of if there was an invasion, another question I've sort of seen leveled at the West, at NATO, is what could they really do? It's pretty clear that they won't send troops to Ukraine. So is it just about sanctions?
It's about a variety of responses. It clearly, talking tough and isolating a country and its leaders in political forums around the world has a certain moral strength, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. The crucial ingredient will be economic sanctions. But the other side of the coin here is, were the Russians to decide on military action, remember that they would be taking military action against a country that they are culturally very close to. There are lots of ties. I think the Russian population wouldn't be comfortable with a really bloody war against the Ukraine, and nor would they be very happy about the death toll. So the actual consequences of military action are not very healthy for Putin. The economic consequences will be very tough. He might well be able to ride them out and hope to cope, but I don't think he wants any of those. Who knows what he will eventually decide to do, but putting pressure like this suits him better than actually taking military action.
Because there are some who believe, I think President Macron of France, maybe one of them, is pretty certain that this is a game of brinkmanship, really, and that he isn't actually intending to go in. He's just trying to assert his dominance, as you say, maybe get a better security deal, and also ultimately he wants to stop Ukraine joining NATO, doesn't he?
He wants that. He is hoping that he could put pressure on. I think he made two calculations about this coercive diplomacy. First of all, he thought that NATO and Europe wouldn't be as united as it's turned out to be. And second of all, he thought that the Biden administration, on the basis of its poor performance with Afghanistan, would not be as committed to this. And I think both of inaccurate calculations. There's been a greater unity across the Atlantic, and with NATO, there have been some divisions. The extent to which the Germans want to talk as tough about Nord Stream 2 being cut off and Macron trying to pursue his own particular agenda, going individually to Moscow to try and solve. So that there are these elements, but I think there are variations on the theme of unity more than deep divisions.
You touched upon Nord Stream 2 there for our listeners who don't quite know what that means. This is about, bringing it down to what people understand on the base level in their day-to-day lives. This is about our energy prices, isn't it?
That's right. Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that goes to the Baltic to Europe. Europe is very heavily dependent on Russian gas. I think something like 40% of the gas for Europe. I think it's only about 5% of our gas.
And so does that mean that Putin is that Putin's biggest strength at the moment, that he has that kind of, we haven't developed enough in terms of alternatives and renewables, and we are reliant in Europe on that pipeline. Is that a card in his deck, so to speak?
It is indeed. There are various measures going on behind the scenes to try and cope with that. A calculation was done by a Berlin think tank that provided the winter isn't too harsh, there are sufficient supplies of gas in the reserves in Europe for Europe to get through without further supplies, but it would leave the reserves dangerously low, and they wouldn't like to do that. So I think there are ways of coping with it, but there'll be two problems. There'll be shortages. There'll be much more acute availability of gas, and it will also push up the prices. This kind of thing pushes up the international price of energy, so it would create problems for people across Europe, across North America too.
Just looking again at the potential of an invasion, I think we saw a tweet from the Ministry of Defence today, which we might be able to get up on our screen, which showed a variety of routes and options there that the military presence that you've already discussed could be deployed to create an invasion. You might be able to see those arrows there on your screen.
Yeah.
Could you kind of lay out for us how you could see an invasion happening? I've seen, obviously you mentioned before about Crimea, which was quite different, wasn't it? It was a very specific area. Would it involve kind of, marching on Kiev, for example?
There are so many different options. If I had to guess on the most likely option, it is looking at the map there, the the pink shaded area to the right of the map, the east, the Donbass area. There are two areas of the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, which are separatist areas. There are units in there, Russian-speaking Ukrainians sympathetic to Russia and help from Russia. And one technique would be for forces to move to the west of there and to cut off the Ukrainian forces from the rest of the Ukraine, and maybe launch attacks on Kiev, which you see 3 arrows pointing to Kiev at the top of that particular map. I very much doubt that if there's military action, it'll be a full-scale invasion. That's too large an operation, and it wouldn't be needed in order to serve the purpose of weakening the Ukrainians. If they cut off the eastern zone and had solid defense against any attack, a counterattack, because the best Ukrainian forces are within that particular area. So any kind of help for those forces would come from less effective forces from beyond that area. So I think that is the most likely scenario, but it's a guess. Like, we're all guessing. He may, if he does something, I think it's more likely to happen there, which ties up with what Boris Johnson spoke about when he's talking about the attack on a kindergarten. In the Russian radio and media in general, they're talking about all kinds of genocide being launched by the Ukrainians against the Russian speakers in these zones, suggesting that they may have to intervene in order to deal with it. So if something happens, I think that's the more likely scenario.
Both President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson spoke about the idea of false flag operations, which I guess is to sort of give the Russians the excuse. It would be, wouldn't it, to invade? That they're not true scenarios, are they?
No. In effect, a false flag operation is when people dressed up as your foe launch an attack, and it turns out they're not that. In fact, that's how the Second World War broke out. Concentration camp inmates were dressed up as Polish soldiers to launch an attack on the Germans in September 1939, and then they were all killed by the Germans. I'm not suggesting an exact parallel, in case you.
No. But it's as you say, it's all part of that, creating a scenario where they can, I guess, have that excuse to go in. Just before we sort of round up, really, there are so many people talking about the different scenarios that might play out in the next few days. It's obviously extremely worrying time for a lot of people. To put you on the spot, what is your best guess about how the next, say, week will play out?
It's very difficult to say, and I'll probably look a fool in a week's time, whatever I say, but my suspicion is there will be some form of minor military action, and with a bit of luck, we may then move to some kind of diplomatic arrangement, some kind of talks about a new security framework. But that's the best guess I can come up with.
Because it seems to me that the issue of Russia wanting to decide whether Ukraine can or can't, or very much can't, join NATO is not one that's going to get resolved, because there's no way that Ukraine are going to agree to that, is there?
No, the Ukrainian, neither Ukrainians nor NATO will accept the idea that another country can determine whether or not Ukraine or any other country becomes a member of NATO. But I don't see NATO admitting Ukraine anytime soon as a member. There has to be a process. They get to a stage where NATO agrees to an action plan, and then over a course of years that happens, and there hasn't been any agreement towards a Ukrainian action plan for NATO, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Putin might go away,
being able to have the option and the choice to, if they wish to.
Yes, I don't think that either NATO or the United States are going to change their minds on that particular position, but they might well be able to find some kind of arrangements about missiles, about security. There used to be a NATO-Russia forum, which was closed down, was designed to help eliminate any kind of troubles in that region. Whether or not something like that can be resurrected, I don't know.
Well, let's hope that a diplomatic solution can be found, because, as we say, it's obviously a very, very worrying time. Dr. Michael Hopkins, just want to thank you for your expertise, for your insight. It's really, really helpful for our readers understanding this complex and worrying situation. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.